Okay, and we're live. I always give everybody a minute to join us in the live stream. So I will get us started in just 1 second. I see. There we go. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. We are still doing some virtual events from One More Page, but we hope by the end of next month, at least some of our events will be in person again. We'll be so happy to pair authors and readers together again in the same room safely. So, but we also are going to try to figure out how, if we can still also stream some of the events, because I know it's great for us to be able to reach people beyond our Arlington area. So hopefully we will be able to do that, and we'll keep letting people know about that. There we go. I see more people joining. So I am going to get us started. All right. Welcome to our virtual One More Page space. I'm Amber. Happy to welcome 3 great authors here tonight for the launch of Katharine Schellman's new book, The Silence in the Library, which we were very excited to get in the store the other day and actually have her come in and sign some copies already. But today is launch day, so happy to be able to celebrate with you. I'm going to do a quick introduction of the authors, but first I just want to explain how this works. So if anybody wants to comment, say hi, ask a question, whatever you'd like to do. If you are on Facebook, you can do that in the Facebook comments. And if you are watching on YouTube, you just do that in the live chat area on YouTube. If you're watching on Eventbrite and you want to make a comment, you got to hop over to one of those places as well to join us. So feel free to ask a question at any time during the session. If we don't get to them during the talk, we will towards the end. So just wanted to make sure everybody knows that. So I'm going to introduce our authors tonight, and then I'm going to pop out and enjoy the conversation just like everyone else tuning in online tonight. So we will start with Katharine Schellman, who is our guest of the hour, I guess, this evening. Katharine is a former actor, a one-time political consultant, and currently the author of the Lily Adler mysteries. She's a graduate of the College of William and Mary and currently lives and writes in the mountains of Virginia with her family. Also joining us is Kate Belli, who writes historical mysteries and contemporary thrillers. She's been fascinated by history from an early age and earned a PhD in American art, and has worked as an antiques appraiser, a museum curator, and a college professor, and has lived all over, but currently lives and works in central Pennsylvania with her husband and son. And Greer Mcallister is a local author here from DC. She's an author of historical fiction that often centers on fascinating female characters, including her most recent, The Arctic Fury. As I learned last week during an event that she joined us for last week, her next work is in a totally different genre, which was, I believe, fantasy. Maybe we'll hear more about that tonight. And Greer, like I said, lives nearby with her family in DC. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you all and enjoy the chat.
Thank you so much, Amber, and thank you everyone for being here, and for Greer and Kate for joining me. I'm really excited to have an event to launch this book, because my first Lily Adler mystery, The Body in the Garden, if I can remember to turn the right direction, it came out right at the beginning of the pandemic last year. So this is really fun to actually get to do this. Didn't get to last year. So as Amber said, I write historical mysteries. The Body in the Garden was last year's, the first Lily Adler mystery, and this year Silence in the Library just came out. So that's the second in the series. They are set in Regency, England, and they're sort of traditional mysteries, kind of a historical whodunit. I once had someone describe them to me as like a BBC costume drama, but with murder instead of marriage. And I think that's a pretty good summation of them. And then next year, I'll also be launching a Jazz Age mystery series. So I'm really excited to switch time periods a little bit and do that. But I love playing around in the Regency. I think it's such a fun era to work in. So I love writing Lily and her friends, and I'm really glad to have another adventure for them coming out this year. And so Kate and Greer, do you want to talk a little bit about what you have coming out right now, what you have going on, or should we dive right into questions and chatting a little bit?
I could talk. I'm sort of between things right now. So, like Amber said, my 4 works so far have been historical fiction. The Arctic Fury, which is the most recent, it came out last December, but I feel like I've been doing events for it pretty much since December through now, which is the great thing about, pandemic silver lining. The nice thing about virtual events is, if I were so lucky as to go on a book tour with my previous books, my publisher would pick a couple of cities, I'd pick a couple of cities, and I might be gone. Like a major book tour would be 2 weeks, and I would go to 10 stores, and that would be it. And I've been to 30 stores, 40 stores, and we can have a conversation like this, even though we're not all located in the same place, and none of us are located at the bookstore. So that's kind of an upside. Clinging to all the upsides we can. But the Arctic, geez. I thought I had it all figured out, and tonight's proven me wrong. The Arctic Fury is set in 1850. As Amber said, most of my books center on sort of extraordinary women in extraordinary circumstances. The Arctic Fury is about a fictional all-female expedition to the Arctic in search of John Franklin's lost expedition. So the Franklin expedition is a real event, really was lost, and his widow, Lady Jane Franklin, really did send a bunch of expeditions in pursuit, in search of those lost ships. I've sort of put a fictional twist on it with this all-female expedition cobbled together from sort of interesting types of women and interesting specific historical women of the 1850s. So it's a what-if story. I like to use historical events as sort of a jumping off point and inspiration. And then the next thing, as Amber also said, is fantasy, but I want us all to talk later about what we've got coming up next, because I know there's a lot of fun things coming up. But yeah, so far it's been historical fiction, a lot of which has a sort of mystery or crime element to it. So I think all of our stuff fits together really nicely in that way.
Definitely does. And Kate, you have a book coming out later this year, don't you?
I do. I have the second book, like you. I'm a few months behind you, I would say, in my historical mystery series, which is set in Gilded Age New York. So it's the late 1880s New York City. Very loosely inspired. My heroine was very loosely inspired by Nellie Bly, which I know Greer has delved way more deeply into. Mine was a very loose inspiration, but I wanted to write in a period where women had a lot more freedom. I do think it's a really interesting connection with all our books. These really strong female heroines and protagonists. And so this is the Gilded Got the Mystery series, the first one. Deception by Gaslight, which is a Kindle deal, $1.99 right now. And then, yes, I have the second book, Betrayal on the Bowery. Here's an arc coming out. I don't have a beautiful setup behind me like y'all do, but there it is. This will be out in October. So that's exciting. And yeah, more to come after that.
I like that we're all working in very different time periods, which kind of, Greer, you mentioned a little bit that you're inspired by real world events, but all of your books are in different time periods, which I find so fascinating because I can feel like I can barely research one really well. And you've got like completely different ones for each book. So I'm wondering, do you tend to find a historical event and think, oh, I want to do characters and story inspired by that? Or do you start with the idea of like, I really want to do a female expedition in the Arctic or whatever I want to write about a detective in the 1800s and then find historical figures to influence that and do the research that way. Which comes first?
For me, it's different for each book. A lot of times I'll find sort of an anchor. The Magician's Lie was the first one, and I really had no idea what I was doing with historical fiction. But I came up with the idea of, we hear all the time about male magicians cutting women in half, like stage illusionists. Magicians cut women in half. It's just a thing that they do. But then I thought, well, I've never heard anything about a female magician cutting a man in half, but I'm not like super up on the magic scene. So maybe it's a thing that's been happening for years and years. And it turns out the 1980s was the first time that somebody, that a woman made that sort of her signature illusion as a working magician. So my choices were write a contemporary book about a female magician cutting a man in half. And I'm like, well, it would probably still be a little shocking, but not that shocking. I could write a book set in the 1980s, and I've lived through the 1980s once, and I don't care to do it again. Or I could research what's the golden age of magic? Like when could somebody have made headlines? When would most people have seen a magician? And I sort of started digging in and found a real world figure who does make an appearance in The Magician's Lie, named Adelaide Herman, who was called the Queen of Magic, and she, did the bullet catch at the Metropolitan Opera House in 1897, and did all of these amazing things. So I'm like, okay, well, I want to anchor it on her, but I don't want the book to be about her, because she never cut anybody in half, as far as we know, either on stage or off. So I sort of put that fictional magician Arden alongside her. And then pulled in real world events around the same time. There's a fire that happens in that book that's completely based on a real fire, unfortunately, in Chicago. And so yeah, I think it's usually the idea, and then sort of expanding outward and finding other research that goes along with it. And like Kate said, my book Woman 99 was inspired by Nellie Bly. So it was sort of like, okay, Nellie Bly is really cool. She went into a madhouse without telling anyone, and pretended to be mad, and got institutionalized for it. And luckily, everything turned out okay. But if you want to read about Nellie Bly's exploits, Nellie Bly wrote about them. So I didn't have anything to add to her story by fictionalizing it. So I took a character and said, well, why else would somebody do something that ridiculous? And the answer, of course, was love. So it's her love for her sister that causes her to go into the asylum and try to rescue her sister who's been put in there. So there are different time periods, but I keep landing in this sort of 1850 to 1905 America. So for me, at least not leaving the country has been a big part of it. I don't feel like, and even though I can't go to historical America, and I'm writing, sort of coast to coast, I still feel more anchored in that than I would writing about Regency England. So I think we all sort of find our own comfort and comfortable spaces that we write in. So how about you, Kate?
Well, I also am mostly comfortable in 19th century America, since that's what my academic work has always focused on. So it actually was inspired to start a series because of books set in the Regency period, though. And, a year ago, nobody would have known what I was talking about unless you really read a lot of romance. But it was Julia Quinn's Bridgerton series that I loved so much when I was reading it in the early 2000s. And I envisioned a similar series that's set in Gilded Age New York City, which was, again, something I know, but has the same sort of similar class tensions you can work with, but then a little more freedom for women. And so I started my career in romance. I started writing in romance. This series originated as a romance series, but when I first tried to sell it, it was not. It's expanded somewhat. Romance, and people weren't writing as many Gilded Age romances. There were a few authors who had started in Regency and moved into Gilded Age and doing very well in that space, but publishers were very hesitant to take on more. But there was already an undercurrent of mystery, and when my agent pitched it to this particular to our press, Katharine, that we share, they said, we'd love to see this as a mystery. And so I sort of rewrote the first book. And as it turned out, I'm much better at writing murder than kissing. So even though there's still an undercurrent of romance, it's slight. I like writing murder more. But yeah, it was really a write what you know thing for the same reason. I already know a lot about 19th century New York City, and it was really fun to inhabit that world. I love the Regency period, and I really wanted to ask you about that, Katharine. But yeah, I just felt like that was a whole nother level of research that I wasn't at that moment when I started writing, prepared to undertake. But I was interested, Katharine, in how you kind of landed on that period, because again, maybe because it's my background originally was so much more in romance. I think of it as such a strong romance period for that genre. And I know there are other writers doing Regency set mysteries, but I don't feel like it's as common. I feel like Victorian era 19th century for historical mysteries is where you see it a little, or later 19th century, I should say, because the Regency is 19th century, just earlier.
It's really funny that you told that story, because I actually originally thought I was writing a romance also. I thought Dead Body in the Garden, which had a completely different title and a completely different plot, initially was going to be a romance, which is how it ended up as in the Regency, because as you said, that's a really strong genre. Like the Regency romance is a thing. And I also read Julia Quinn's Bridgerton series in the early 2000s and was really influenced by that. But I got probably about a third of the way through and realized, because Lily Adler, my main character, is a widow at the start of the series. And I thought it was going to be the story of how like she found love again. And I was writing it to be that story. And then I got partway through it and I realized that the character as I've written her is actually not ready to move on. Like she's not, I'm not writing a woman who is ready to move on with that part of her life. She's not looking for love. She's not ready to say like, and I've put this first marriage behind me. She's actually still very deeply in love with her husband who died 2 years ago. And she's trying to move on with her life, but that doesn't necessarily have to mean finding romance again or finding love again. And so then for a little while I had characters wandering around in search of a plot, where you're just like, I really like these characters and I'm just going to write scenes where they're doing stuff until I figure out what the through line for those scenes are. And then I had a dead body show up and thought, oh, okay, it's a murder mystery now. So I ended up really, it came together so much more strongly once I had that very deliberate through line of, we're trying to solve a murder. So I think it was always meant to be a murder mystery, but it just took me a little while to figure that out. And actually, I ended up feeling very good about the fact that it wasn't, the point of it wasn't for her to find love again. Not to say anything bad about those plots, because I love a good romance, but it felt a little different for the setting, like you said, Kate, because it's a setting that is so strongly linked to the romance genre. So it did feel like a little bit of a fun departure, but there's also a lot more, I think, Regency mysteries starting to come out now. I think it's a genre that's moving, for a time period that's moving into other genres. So it's fun to be part of that too. It's a little bit of a crossover. So I think, it's kind of a gateway into mysteries for people who maybe read a lot of Regency romances.
Well, maybe Regency is creeping into other genres just because of the Bridgerton effect, right? People are always talking about, okay, are we going to see more of this thing that was enormously successful? And usually the answer is yes. Yeah. And then if that thing is World War II, then it just becomes so popular, it seems like it will never end. Just historical fiction about World War II is just nonstop thing. And I was at the Historical Novel Society conference virtually recently. And when we had that conference 2 years ago, people are like, oh, World War II is over. And it isn't. And then like, is World War II over? Probably not. But I like the expanding into different genres and that gateway idea.
So I'm curious, since we all do write historical fiction but in such different time periods, I actually, aside from reading the books, I don't know a whole lot about the history of the time periods that you all write in, which makes it really fun to read, because I feel like I'm learning something new every time I pick up a book and read a good story. But I'm curious with that said, like, I feel like I always discover really weird things when I'm researching a book. Like this is not something that's common knowledge about this time period. And most of them, I haven't found a good way to like actually fit them into a story yet. So I'm wondering for each of you, what's like the weirdest or coolest or just most bizarre thing that you've found during your research that you haven't been able to fit into a story yet?
Yeah, I was going to say, you go ahead, you start with that, Greer, because I'm sure you've got a bunch.
Okay. Well, the thing that springs to mind is just in the Arctic Fury, the Arctic exploration stuff there's just countless weirdnesses in the real life Franklin expedition. Like they think that, obviously you send a bunch of unprepared ships into the unmapped Arctic and they don't come back. They died for reasons that have to do with going to the Arctic and not being prepared, and getting stuck in ice. But they think that also the cans that they took canned food because they were planning to be on for several years. And they think that because they went with the lowest bidder and an inexperienced person who was canning the food, that the lead from the cans was leaking into the food. And so in addition to being stuck unprepared in the Arctic and, thinking about becoming cannibals so that they could survive and all that, the sailors in the Franklin expedition were also probably going crazy from lead poisoning. So I did not, that wasn't really something that I could.
You didn't want to get into that in the book.
Because my characters are not on the Franklin expedition. They're just looking for the Franklin expedition. But things like that, and just reading, there's Lady Franklin's Revenge. There's all sorts of journals that I was reading for the Arctic Fury, because there's just so much written about it. Which is not the case with some of my previous books. But all of these things, I'm like, that is so interesting, and I don't have room for it, and it's not right for this book. But I'd love to hear your answers as well.
I think the weirdest one I've discovered is, apparently in the Regency, there was, in very remote villages, there was this practice called wife selling. And it was like a form of divorce, because it was really hard to get a legal divorce. But particularly if a woman wanted to end her marriage, it was like a weirdly sort of pseudo-feminist practice, where if a woman really wanted to end her marriage, and she, because she was lower class and didn't have the money to actually pursue getting a divorce, and it was really it was, socially very looked down on, and a very fraught process for women in particular. Her husband could sell her to the person she wanted to marry instead. So it would be like he would take her to the village square and sell her to this other person, and then she could go marry the person she wanted to. And it was absolutely not legal. There was no legal backing to it, but in the places where it happened, it was sort of socially recognized enough that she would then be considered not married to the first person, and instead married to her new husband that she wanted to be married to. Which I feel like I want to put that in a book, but it's almost too weird to people would just be, that's very made up. I feel like it's always the things that are not made up that people are the most skeptical of.
Yeah, it's certainly you never see that in a Regency romance. It goes kind of against that. That's so wacky. I try to put in every weird thing I find, I have to say. I'm writing the third book in the series now, and I have a whole very pivotal scene that takes place in Coney Island. And so I'm just knee deep in, Coney Island facts and things that I'm finding all this crazy stuff, and it's really fun to put in. I did in the first book, in Deception by Gaslight, I had a whole scene where my character Genevieve went to a P.T. Barnum Best Baby contest, where this was a thing, and it's late. I mean, this was 1888. It's late for Barnum. It's well past the Greatest Showman sort of era, 20 years down the line or something, and he still was, had a presence, which I didn't quite realize. I mean, you'd think with Barnum and Bailey, it never really went away, but I didn't know how strong it was, in that it was literally it was kind of a beauty contest, but there were prizes for things like this is their language, the fattest baby, and the thinnest baby, and this baby. And it was so delightful and weird. And I had a whole scene where she was sort of forced to go report on this, and was not happy about it. And because she's not particularly maternal, and I had to cut it. It was just too, sometimes you just have to cut those scenes that don't quite work, don't move the story forward. It was just sort of pure fun and not advancing the plot.
That's so.
Maybe save it for a future thing that, it might fit in somewhere in another book, especially if you're doing a series, but
we could.
I want to read that scene now.
Yeah, it could come back around, or maybe it's one of those things that you throw up on the website eventually, and say, here you go, here's an extra scene.
Pre-order bonus for your next book.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So do any of you base characters on people that you know? I think I saw that question in the chat, because we're all talking about historical figures. But I feel like that's something that happens for mystery authors in particular, or crime writers. Like, people want to know, like, are these real people that you're killing off, like, from your life? I don't. I feel like that's like too much of a, like, tempting fate sort of thing to put characters based on real people for me. But what about you two?
No contemporary real people now. I feel like there's an argument to be made that every character is some aspect of us, to have that connection, but especially when we're doing murderers and stuff, it's not that much of a connection, really. And I do feel like we get, as historical writers, we probably get the autobiography question less than contemporary writers, because I do have a lot of friends who write contemporary, who, like, everybody, like, if you're a mom at a school and you're writing about moms behaving badly at a school, then all of the other moms think that you're writing about them. So we don't have to worry about that. At least we get a lot of angry emails about, specific gun models not being available at specific times in history, and how Derringer is spelled and stuff like that. But we don't get the autobiography thing as much, I think. Do you pull in people from real life, Kate?
Historical people like you do, yes, and more are coming in. I've actually, the book I'm writing now, it's the first time I will have incorporated an actual real person as a character who has conversations with people, sort of a named character, rather than just being someone sort of vaguely referenced. I did just write, I wrote, as Amber mentioned, I write contemporary thrillers, and I don't have anything to say about yet about the one that I've completed. But there are some people based on real people I know in that, but with their permission, I will say.
Okay.
It is people they know full well. It was that, yeah. It is very loosely based. Those two friends of mine, and the one at least who has read the manuscript was, it's like, oh no, this is very different from who we actually are. But the germs of the story and the characters started with some real events.
I'm almost too scared to ask people if I could base characters on them. Like, what if they don't like it? But I guess if we're changing them pretty significantly, where it's just like, here's a little kernel that started this character, like that's a nice way to get inspiration.
Yeah.
Are your thrillers standalone, Kate? Because I thought we might talk a little bit about the difference between writing series and standalone, because I'm writing series for the very first time after all these standalones, and it's weird for me. So if you guys have done it in the other direction, like Katharine, you wrote series first and then standalone, right? Or your next one's standalone?
It turns out I'm bad at writing standalone because it's turned into a series now. I'd originally written it as a standalone, and then the publisher who bought it asked, "Do you think we could make this a series?" I was like, "Sure." So it's turned into one now. But yeah, what does that difference feel like for you?
It's, for me, writing a standalone, it was definitely it was just sort of this more encapsulated experience. It was a pandemic book, where it just, again, it started out the germ of the story started out as a romance, as many of my things do. And I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that it was loose. That again, germ, I keep using that word, was loosely based on myself and two good friends who all went through divorces at the same time period. And then, so originally I thought that would be sort of a second chance, maybe not unlike Lily Adler, though. Nobody was without, sort of second chance contemporary romance series. And it was, my agent was just sort of like, I think there's something more interesting there. And I said, well, it's about that, but it's also about these female friends. Like, I want to write about a group of female friends. And she is sort of like, let's think about something more interesting. What about, what would you do for a friend? How far would you go for a friend? Would you kill for a friend? Would you die for a friend? And that kind of made it take off into what it became. But it was different from writing a series. It's always kind of nice that I didn't have to think about continuity. It was harder though, because it took me a long time to get to know the characters in a way that now with my series, I feel like I know them well. I know how they're going to react and, what feels natural for them, even though they sometimes surprise me. But that was a challenge. Just kind of figuring out who these people are. Did you find that difference in your series between your standalones, Greer? Are you looking forward to working more with the characters?
I am. And it's easier for me. I'm a very sloppy writer. And so my first draft has a bunch of stuff in it that doesn't end up in the finished book. And so it's easier for me to let go of things when I'm writing a series to say, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to move this to the next book. But it's moving from historical fiction to epic fantasy. It's really weird, but it's good. It's sort of freeing because when I'm writing historical, like I said, you've got to have an eye for accuracy in the details. And so I was working on book 2 of the epic fantasy series the other day, and I'm like, oh, I want the queen to have like some special delicacy that she enjoys eating. I'm like, I can make it up. Like they grow whatever fruits I say they grow, as opposed to like, what is, Kate Warren, first female Pinkerton detective. What was her favorite delicacy? Nobody knows, but it better be accurate to the period, as opposed to I'm making up profanity in different languages. I'm, the world that I'm, writing in for the Five Queendoms is loosely inspired by a bunch of different ancient worlds, so or ancient empires of Rome and Greece and Persia, and just a much bigger pan-Mediterranean canvas. But I'm not bound to any of those specifically, and so I get to be a magpie and take what I want and ignore what I don't want. And then I'm writing the continuity. I'm writing the glossary and the list of characters that I have to keep track of, as opposed to keeping track of people from real life and being accurate in those details about food and smells and oyster cellars in New York and all the stuff, which I love as a historical fiction writer and as a historical fiction reader. I love those details and feeling swept away and transported to that location. But it sure is a relief to not have to do that in the fantasy series.
How did you end up deciding that you were going to write epic fantasy? That feels like such a big change.
It is. And it's sort of historical fantasy. You can sort of see it that way. But sort of like Kate was talking about conversation with her agent a couple summers ago, I reached out to my agent and said, well, I kind of don't have an idea about a historical book right now, but I have this domestic suspense idea, and then I have this epic fantasy idea, and I told her both, and she's like, don't write domestic suspense, everybody's doing that, but tell me more about the epic fantasy idea. And I said, well, it's kind of like feminist Game of Thrones. And she's like, that sounds interesting. If that's what you want to do that. And so I delved into it and ended up actually getting a second agent to handle just fantasy, because my first agent doesn't handle fantasy, but she encouraged me to do it nonetheless. And it was just like having that freedom and being able to embrace that. And so now it's 3 books so far. And now I have annual deadlines, which I did not have before. My previous books have all been 2 years. So I think that's one of the downsides of the series for me is just the pace is going to be a lot crisper. So we'll see how that goes.
You're working on book 2 right now, right?
Yeah, book one is done and coming out in galleys in the next couple of weeks, probably. There's a cover reveal coming up. And then the book itself comes out next February. So, and I was at One More Page yesterday. I'm like, I'm sending you guys a galley as soon as I get it. Because when my deal announcement came out, their first comment on it was, we are going to sell 1 billion copies. Yes. I'm glad. So, very good. Very good.
So Kate, would you ever write something that's not sort of crime fiction adjacent? Like what would be the out there genre that you would do if you were going to do something completely different?
Oh, something completely different. I don't know. If I would dip a toe into epic fantasy, though I love the idea of a feminist Game of Thrones and wish I had thought of it because it's fascinating and I can't wait to read it. I haven't on the way back burner. We all have a few things. I have more of a straight up women's fiction, kind of 3 generations from a family, triple storyline kind of happening project that I'd like to get to eventually. So that's not super crimey. What about you, Katharine?
I don't know. I think I'd probably lean towards doing some kind of epic fantasy. I don't know if I have, because that's what I read so much growing up. Like I read a lot of fantasy series, and I loved them, but I'm kind of intimidated to write one of my own. The first 2.5 books that I wrote, like the ones that no one will ever see, were all in completely different genres. I think one was like sort of a YA fairy tale retelling. One was more of a contemporary family story, and then one was an attempt at a high fantasy that just didn't go well. So, and like they were all really good practice, but I didn't really feel like I had a story that I could continue on with and like actually polish up and get ready to go out in the world until I started writing Lily Adler. So I'd really like to try a different genre, and I think I would probably lean towards some kind of fantasy, just because that's such a strong background of mine in terms of being a reader. But there's so many people doing so many cool things, like feminist Game of Thrones. Like that sounds awesome. I don't know what I would do that would like have that really cool tagline. So, it would take a lot more brainstorming than I have done so far to come up with the hook for that.
And maybe it just comes to you one day. Maybe you're just going about your business and boom, there's something there. So you never know. I don't know if I could write science fiction. I think I have a reasonable head for science, but I've just never had any ideas in that direction in the way that I've had ideas in lots of other directions. I think I'd love to write romance. I read a lot of it. It sounds like we all do. So there's something there's comfort in it, but there's also so many people are doing amazing different things with different, different ways of working within the form. I love that.
And I think I'm wondering if you found, Greer, like there's such a world building aspect to writing historical fiction. I love reading fantasy because I learned so much about world building from the way fantasy writers pull everything together. And I think a lot of that translates really well to writing historical fiction, and then not just mysteries, but like anything set in history, anything set historically. So have you found that there's sort of some crossover between in terms of the skill set, or does it feel like a completely different thing?
Definitely no. And for me, as well as I've done, sometimes for Women's History Month, I'll do a series of interviews on my website. And so there was one year that I did Women's History Reads. And so I talked to somebody every day about a different author every day about, well, what else do you love reading? And there were other questions too, but I was surprised by how many historical fiction authors said they love fantasy and sci-fi. And part of the reason was the world building, because you don't get into writing historical if you can't respect the detail. And it is a kind of world building, and we're just building a world that is our own past. Regency England or Gilded Age New York. I mean, we don't have any personal experience with those. And you can't go to it. Although I do find, and this is going to be my next question for y'all, whether you find going places physically helps with the research, because I would generally have said, well, I can't go to, 1880 San Francisco. So I'm not going to bother going to San Francisco for Woman 99. But it turned out that I was in San Francisco for other reasons. And I ended up walking along the route that I had written into the book that these two sisters are walking along. And it's San Francisco. So I quickly realized you cannot walk on that street and have a conversation. Like the hill is too steep. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to move. Either they're going to have to stop a lot, or they're going to have to walk on a different street, because they can't take that route and be like chatting. So how do you anchor yourselves in the physical detail? Do you go to places? Do you imagine? Do you eat the food? Listen to the music? Like how do you immerse yourself in it?
I found something similar because while I was writing first Lily Adler book, I took a trip to London, which was it wasn't a research trip. It was a vacation that happened to be in the place where I was setting a book. And I found some very similar things where it wasn't necessarily helping with, the historical details, but just walking around and things like, how long is it going to take you on foot to get from this place to this place? And, just just sort of being able to anchor the physicality in the real world a little bit, I found very interesting. And then there's also points, I think, where I would look at the setting around me and just be like, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to worry about the actual real world details, because you can do that when you're writing historical fiction and say, like, you always want to stay true to the time period, at least for me. But I also am very willing to say, and I will pick and choose which details make it in and which ones I'm just going to ignore, because I want to tell the story the way it's going to unfold.
And you have to pick and choose, because if we put everything in there, it wouldn't be fiction. It would just be a very long list of details of how things looked and smelled and tasted and sounded.
Right.
What about you, Kate? Are you on the ground research or not so much?
A little of both. I started writing this series. I lived in New York then. I lived in New York for a really long time before relocating a few other places and winding up where I am now. I'm outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but I don't live there anymore. So and at the time I started writing, also I was a curator at the Brooklyn Historical Society, which now has a different name. So I was really just deeply immersed in all of this. But since I don't live there anymore, I rely a lot on, actually I do a lot of primary source, research, looking at a lot of newspaper articles, and then a lot of secondary sources come in. And again, since my training is as an art historian, I spend a lot of time looking at images. So a lot of, photographs and paintings from the time period that really helps me, ground myself in the period quite a lot, really be able to pull a lot of details from those kinds of sources.
I also really like reading letters from the time period, writing to each other. I think it gives me a really good idea of just the voice that people would have used casually with each other, how they would have spoken. Because if you read, I love reading fiction from the time period, like that was written in the time period I'm writing in, but people don't necessarily talk the way they talked in books. It's going to be a little bit different. And I find that reading letters that people were writing to their sister or their cousin or their brother actually gives me at least a better sense of what does a voice from that time period sound like.
For sure, because newspapers can be really handy for details and happenings and stuff like that, but that's not necessarily a conversational tone. So I like that letters idea.
And I was really lucky that since I was starting out with the Regency, there's lots of people who were writing letters in the Regency that got preserved. Like somehow it was a very strong letter writing era, diarist era. So, and a lot of those have stuck around. Although again, those are from a very specific class. So you have to extrapolate a little bit from that for people who are not in that class.
And it's so nice that so much of it is digitized now,
I was so grateful for all the archivists putting things online.
Yes, it's been a real help. Yeah, and even then, though, there's some of those details you just can't find. You sort of have to make up because they're just, on another panel I was on, another author and I commiserated on, elevators. Like I was just like, okay, they existed, but would they have been? How common were they? Were they here? Were they there? Like, how do I know? I could not. I spent days trying to answer the elevator question, and finally just was like, well, you know what? Let's go in. Katharine, I was so impressed actually at the Body in the Garden with your use of that kind of conversation and the way the characters addressed each other. And I just felt like you struck this awesome line between the actual formality that really existed, which I feel like, again, when you read sometimes some other genres set in the Regency period, sometimes that gets, is missing. People take obviously liberties with it, and that which helps move the story along, but you were able to keep some of that sort of tension between characters while maintaining the formality. It was really impressive.
Thank you. I think a lot of that is maybe credited to my editor, because I probably err when I'm drafting at least a little more on the side of a little more formal, just because I want to give it a little more of the time period flavor. And she's really good at coming in and saying, like, let's maybe tone it down a little bit here. Like if they're just having a conversation between themselves, maybe they let their guard down a little bit. So I love editors.
Yes. I'm a fan.
Editors and copy editors.
Yes.
Saving us all.
Hi, I'm popping back in. We're at quarter till, and there are a few questions that we haven't gotten to yet. This one that I'm going to pop up first. I think you've already answered just in the discussion, because going from thinking you're writing a romance to then a thriller, I think, do you have a story completely in mind, or does it develop as you write?
I think for me, I've sort of learned my lesson where I do have the story in mind as I'm writing now. I tend to outline pretty thoroughly before I try to treat my outline a little bit like my first draft, especially because when I first wrote The Body in the Garden, even after it turned into a mystery, it was probably about 40,000 words longer than it should have been, just because I was trying to figure out how to write a mystery while I was writing it. And I find that outlining it and having a really clear sense of just here's how I get from point A to point B, even if there's a few little things that pop up in between, makes the story come together much more quickly. What about you, Kate?
I do the same as you. I'm a big plotter. I plot, I outline, I have the story pretty much in my head before I start writing. But then I try to be open to shifts. If the characters, again, take you in a different direction, something happens, or sometimes when you're writing, it's like, oh, that actually isn't going to work. That part that I outlined is not going to work anymore. It's not going to work. And being flexible enough, and I'm sure you do this too, where you sort of take some stuff out or put something new in, something different works better. But for the most part, the story is usually pretty set.
Mine is similar, that I know where I'm starting and I know where I'm ending, and I have an outline. I just throw it out like halfway through, but I have a plan. I always make a plan because I think that is good. But I write also completely out of order. So I'll write the beginning and I'll write the end and I'll write something in the middle, and then I'll just write whatever wherever the fancy strikes until it's all filled in into a complete but terrible draft. So for me, a lot of the writing, just so much of it comes in the rewriting. But having the beginning, I can't write the beginning until I know what the end is, because it's gotta connect in the right way. But the middle changes a lot.
I think writing the middle is always the hardest part, because you always have a really clear idea of like, oh, this is where we're starting and it's going to be good, and this is where we're ending and it's going to be good too, and then stuff happens in between, and it'll hopefully be good too.
Great. You talked a little bit about how you do your research, but I think this is interesting. Is it difficult to stay true to the time period that the book is written in?
I think for me, it's a little bit of a pick and choose, kind of like we were talking about. I want to always give the flavor of the time period and make people feel like the world I'm writing in is very grounded, but while remembering that it is fiction, and it's okay to make things up or fudge things a little bit or just leave out details if they don't work with the story. What about you, Sarah?
For me, the real issue is making sure that the characters aren't too modern in their mindset and their morality and their way of being. And I heard Mary Doria Russell speak at a conference a few years back, and she writes a whole bunch of different things, but for the purposes of this discussion, she's really amazing in historical fiction, particularly at the time and Wild West around the OK Corral. And she said what she always remembers is the past is not just now with hats. And hats are very important in historical fiction. Like, people want to know what the hat is. But it's also just a way of saying, like, it isn't just, you can't just take modern people and who were raised the way that we are and think the way that we do and plop them back in, and put a bustle on them and call it, historical fiction. And so I have characters in my books who, parents who are terrible to their kids because, terrible in what we would think of as terrible to their kids, who were very much typical of the time period, and just trying to keep that in mind, trying to keep their beliefs and their lives and their inner, however much of it is going to make it into the finished book, trying to keep sort of their inner core in mind as a person of that period. What would a person of that period be saying and doing and thinking, as opposed to just, well, I have this great idea for a girl who saves her sister, and I'm going to put it, in 1889 because Nellie Bly did her thing in 1888.
What about you, Kate?
I think y'all have mostly covered it. That sounds like we all have very similar methods, which is so fascinating and fun. but you always miss stuff. Greer, you said earlier, you get this sort of angry emails, but the model of gun wasn't available or whatever. There was, I've gotten a few of those about phrases, turns of phrase that, weren't commonly used for another 20 years down the line or something. And there's stuff you just, try as hard as you might, you still just tend to miss. I do research turns of phrase, though, a lot more than I used to after I got that comment. I was like, wait a minute. Yeah.
Well, there's always going to be someone who's an expert in the time period who's like, oh, I noticed this detail that you missed. You just can't escape it.
Yeah. You can't say that person was dynamite because dynamite didn't exist yet.
Right.
So you have to say something about gunpowder. Luckily, and this is why I say copy editors save us, a lot of that stuff for me gets flagged before it makes it to the final book. Thank goodness. And then we can go back and go like, oh no, people didn't say haywire until the 1930s. So right. Nothing's going haywire in that particular book.
Well, how about this? Do you have a difference here? Are you morning writers or evening writers?
I think right now I'm a whenever I can squeeze it in writer. I really like getting up early to write and just sort of starting my day with that. I'm not always good about making it happen. I prefer that to staying up late to write, but I tend to do I'd say the majority of my writing sort of during workday hours because I have a 4-year-old and that's when he's in daycare.
I feel like I often hear that from moms who are writers. You fit it in around the kids.
Yeah. And around my day job too.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, evening, weekend, vacation, 10 minutes in the Trader Joe's parking lot, desperation kind of writer, which is good. And then you learn how to sort of cue yourself up. I have a theme song for each of my books. And so when I sit down to write, I play the theme song and that puts me back in the mindset because I can't sort of I can, and I sometimes do spend half an hour dinking around in the manuscript and I'm like, oh, okay, what's going to come next? But then I didn't write for half an hour. So if I can get quickly into it, whatever time of day that happens to be, then I can write successfully with whatever chunk of time I have.
Same. It really just depends on the day. I prefer to do it in the morning. I used to get up, and again, a lot of it's around day job, a lot of it's around kids. So yeah, when my son was a baby, I used to get up super early. But now he likes to get up early, so I tend to write late or once, this past year was a challenge because he wasn't in school or daycare. He was home. He was doing a remote kindergarten. So it was a lot of sort of catch as catch can, a lot more of that, and I sort of had to turn into an evening writer for a lot of these books.
There's definitely weeks or months or years when you shift your habits pretty significantly just because you have to.
Yeah.
So Ziva has a lot of great questions. So if anybody else has any, please feel free to pop them in. We've got a few more minutes, but I'll go back up to an earlier one of hers. How do you know if you're going too far with the fantasy aspect of the book? And she followed that up with, can you go too far?
I think as long as it feels, I think you can get away with a lot in terms of the world and what your world is doing and what is happening plot wise, as long as I think for me, characters feel really grounded. Like, do they have consistent personalities? Are they reacting in a way that feels believable, like the way a real person would react to whatever is happening, and the way this person would react to what is happening? I think for me as a reader, and I think for a lot of readers, there's a willingness to offer a lot of suspension of disbelief in terms of the world and in terms of plot, as long as the way people are behaving feels very believable. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. At least I hope that's how people are reading it, because that's how I'm writing it.
Yeah, I think anchoring in the characters, and then I think specifically if it's fantasy and you're making stuff up, you set the rules, but then you have to obey the rules. So I recently read a book called Star Eater that is about cannibalistic nuns who are like fighting zombies and stuff, and they get their magic from eating like their mothers. So that is a completely out there idea, but the way that she portrays it, and she's got a whole system around it, and like, when does it pass from one generation to the next, and it's in the larger context of sort of mystery, it makes sense and it works within the context of the book. And so, you know, if you have magic in your world and you're saying that you know, people's magic comes from a particular thing, or that, you know, in my world there are 6 types of magic, 6 is not too many, as long as I'm completely consistent about how I apply it and how people's powers work within that.
And I think the historical period also isn't when you're writing historical fiction, serves as the grounding aspect, as well as character reaction, as you so aptly said, Katharine. You know, really, but just like we were talking about, you know, there's not going to be, you know, the copy editors will catch. How many telephones does somebody have? Like, you know, that keeps it from getting too much into the fantastical, if you're trying to stay true to the period.
Okay. And Roberta had another question about writing a series. Do you have a finishing point in mind?
I really want to know your ladies' answers to this question, because I have, for my current series, it's contracted for 3 books. I really want to write 5, partly because it's the 5 queendoms, but I do have sort of an overarching thing that some of the seeds I've put in the first book are supposed to pay off 5 books down the line. And if I have to condense it into 3, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it. Don't tell my editor. But I have a very clear finishing point in mind, with, you know, some wiggly stuff, you know, partway through. I don't have all 5 books planned out. But I have a very clear, like, I know exactly what's going to happen on the last page of the 5th book. But that's obviously not the way it is for everybody. So I want to hear other opinions.
I think it's interesting because the Lily Adler mysteries they fall into like the amateur sleuth genre. And it's a very particular type of series where the plots are so self-contained within the books, where you don't necessarily have like a murder mystery that's going over, you know, 3 or 4 books, but you do have the character arcs that continue over the whole series. So right now I'm contracted for a 3rd book, but not necessarily beyond that. I'm hoping for more. So we'll see what happens. But I think if I had to finish up in 3 books, I would maybe not end on the character beat that I want to end on. So I'm hoping I'll get at least 4, because I think I could do it in 4 if I needed to. But I also think that in terms of, you know, I don't have necessarily like, oh, and this is going to be the last character beat that the last book ends on, because I think the characters could go on and do a lot of things, but there are some specific character arc elements that, like, okay, if I was wrapping up the series, I would want to wrap up these 3 things for these 3 people, sort of ideas.
Yes. I'm also contracted for a 3rd book. They said I'm like 6 months behind you. But yeah, contracted for a 3rd that I'm writing now. And yeah, I'm hoping for more also, because I don't feel done. They don't feel done. It's not going to be wrapped up, those characters. Again, if I have to, I could, but I think they could do with more. And other than that, I think, no, I don't really have one in mind. They can go on for, you know, I think until readers or I get tired of them, you know, or my press gets tired of them, you know, until, you know, maybe an endpoint will sort of come more organically the longer they go. But I don't have one in mind right now.
But there's almost no limit, right, with that sort of, with the historical mystery amateur sleuth genre. Like, I think Tasha Alexander's Lady Emily books, she's on like 12 or 19 or something. Like, it's just, it goes on and on and on. Because like you said, Katharine, like, it's a self-contained, if it's a case can be solved. And yet there's more, you know, it's like an episode of television.
Or Annalee Huber or Deanna Rayborn or any of, you know, those are all getting into the 8s and 9s and 10s, and they're all still really, you know, great.
I love Deanna Rayborn. I love Veronica Speedwell. So
yeah,
I just picked up her most recent one, and it's sitting on my nightstand for when I finish the current draft that I'm working on.
That'll be
so disciplined.
I feel like I can't read in my own genre when I'm like this deep in a genre. I have to sort of limit my exposure to what other people are writing. I tend to read a lot of nonfiction when I'm drafting, just because it's completely different.
That's interesting.
That's great. Well, you guys were at the hour. It's 8:00. How did that happen? Thank you all so much this evening. Thanks for everybody for tuning in and for the great questions. I did drop links into comments, so if folks want to order any of the books we talked about, you can do that from One More Page. So thanks again, and we'll see you at the next event, maybe in person. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.